Imagine this for a moment. You're standing on the deck of a quiet harbor at sunrise. The water is calm, the air is soft, and then out of nowhere, the sky fills with planes. Explosions tear across the bay, battleships burn, sirens scream. In a single morning, a distant country that many Americans barely thought about becomes a hated enemy. Now jump forward a few decades. Those same two countries are sharing military bases, signing trade deals, doing joint military exercises, and collaborating on everything from video games and cars to cutting-edge technology. American kids grow up watching anime and eating sushi. Japanese kids grow up playing American video games and listening to American music. Somewhere along the way, enemy quietly turned into ally. How does that happen? How do Japan and America go from Pearl Harbor and Hiroshima to handshake photos, shared strategies, and mutual trust? That is the story we're going to walk through in this video. Because the transformation from bitter enemies to close allies didn't happen by accident. It was built step by step through war, occupation, fear, strategy, and finally, something that looks a lot like friendship. Let's go back to before everything exploded. For most of their history, Japan and the United States barely knew each other. Japan was closed off from the outside world for centuries, and the US was a young nation focused on its own continent. That changed in the mid-1800s, when American warships forced Japan to open its ports to foreign trade. From that moment, Japan made a decision: it would modernize fast, or it would be swallowed by the powers around it. Japan industrialized at lightning speed. It built factories, railways, a modern army and navy. It defeated China in war. It defeated Russia in war. It began to see itself as a great power, deserving of respect and influence. But in the Pacific, there was another power growing: the United States. By the early 1900s, both countries had serious interests in Asia and the Pacific. Japan expanded into Korea and parts of China. The US controlled the Philippines and had major economic interests in the region. On the surface, they were not yet enemies, but underneath there was tension. Two powerful nations, both looking at the same map, both wanting security, resources, and influence. Those tensions exploded in the 1930s. Japan invaded deeper into China. At the same time, the US began to see Japan as a threat to its own vision of the Pacific. When Japan kept expanding, America responded with economic pressure. Embargoes on oil and steel, the resources Japan desperately needed. In Tokyo, leaders faced a choice: back down or strike before they were strangled. They chose war. On December 7, 1941, Japanese forces launched a surprise attack on Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. In a matter of hours, American ships burned in the harbor and thousands were dead or wounded. The shock was total. Overnight, the US public, which had been divided about entering another war, united around one idea: Japan was the enemy, and it had to be defeated. What followed in the Pacific was a brutal, grinding war. Island by island, battle by battle, American and Japanese soldiers fought in some of the most horrific conditions imaginable. Places like Midway, Guadalcanal, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa became symbols of unimaginable sacrifice. For many Americans, Japanese soldiers were portrayed as fanatical and ruthless. For many Japanese, American forces were seen as a relentless, overwhelming invader. The hatred was real, and it was fed by propaganda on both sides. Each country told its people that the other was not just an opponent, but an existential threat. By 1945, Japan was losing. Its navy was shattered, its cities were being burned to the ground by firebombing campaigns. And then came the final blows: 2 atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. In the span of a few days, entire cities were destroyed. Tens of thousands died instantly. Many more would suffer the effects for years. Japan surrendered. The emperor's voice, almost never heard in public, came on the radio and told the Japanese people that the war was over. At that moment, Japan went from imperial power to occupied nation. And this is where the story of enemy turning into ally really begins. After the surrender, the United States did something unusual. Instead of carving Japan into pieces or punishing it endlessly, it decided to rebuild it. The US occupation, led by General Douglas MacArthur, was one of the most ambitious social experiments in modern history. American officials wrote a new constitution for Japan. One of its most famous parts was Article 9, a clause that said Japan would forever renounce war as a way to solve international disputes. In simple terms, Japan agreed not to maintain a normal offensive military. Instead, it would rely on self-defense forces and, as time went on the protection of the United States. The occupation broke up large landholdings and gave more rights to ordinary citizens. Women gained the right to vote. Political parties were reshaped, schools were restructured, censorship controlled what could be said about the war and the occupation itself. In many ways, the US tried to turn Japan into a peaceful, democratic showcase in Asia. At first, this wasn't about friendship. It was about control and security. The US wanted to make sure Japan would never again threaten it or its allies. But while the occupation was still underway, the world changed again. The Cold War began. The Soviet Union rose as a rival superpower. China turned communist. A new war broke out in Korea. Suddenly, from Washington's point of view, Japan was no longer just a defeated enemy. It was a strategically vital piece on the Cold War chessboard. Japan's location, its potential industrial power, and its access to the Pacific made it incredibly valuable. So American policy shifted. It was no longer enough just to demilitarize Japan. Now, the US needed Japan to be stable, prosperous, and firmly on the western side of the global divide. In 1951, the San Francisco Peace Treaty formally ended the state of war and occupation, and a new security treaty between Japan and the US was signed. Japan regained its sovereignty in 1952. But there was a key detail. The United States kept its military bases in Japan, especially in strategically important places like Okinawa. In exchange, the US promised to protect Japan if it was attacked. Japan, the country that had once tried to sink the American fleet, now depended on that same country to defend it. With defense largely outsourced to the US, Japan was free to focus on something else, rebuilding and growing its economy. And it did that with extraordinary success. The 1950s, 60s, and 70s saw what people later called the Japanese economic miracle. Factories hummed, new technologies were developed and refined. Japanese companies began producing high-quality cars, electronics, and machines that would soon flood global markets. Names like Toyota, Honda, Sony, and Panasonic became known around the world. The US played a major role in this. American markets were open to Japanese goods. American security allowed Japan to spend far less on its military than other developed countries, freeing up money for industry, infrastructure, and innovation. At the same time, Japan's growth helped the American economy too. Trade flowed in both directions. Were there disagreements? Absolutely. In the 1970s and 80s, trade tensions flared. American workers complained about Japanese imports undercutting their jobs. Politicians made speeches about unfair competition. But these were arguments inside a partnership, not the kind of hatred that defined the 1940s. While all of this was happening at the political and economic level, something else was happening at the cultural level. American music, movies, and fashion spread through Japan. Young Japanese listened to rock, watched Hollywood films, and picked up American slang. At the same time, Japanese culture began to seep into American life. Anime, manga, martial arts, video games, sushi, and Japanese cars started to show up everywhere. Slowly, ordinary people on both sides stopped seeing each other as the enemy from the war. For younger generations, the idea that Japan and America had once tried to destroy each other felt distant, like a history lesson rather than a living memory. By the 1990s, the world had changed again. The Cold War ended with the collapse of the Soviet Union. Some people wondered if the US-Japan alliance would weaken. If the original reason for the partnership had faded, would the relationship fade with it? Instead, new reasons appeared. North Korea pursued nuclear weapons and long-range missiles. China's economy exploded, and its military began to modernize and expand. Both Japan and the United States saw these developments as serious concerns. Their security cooperation deepened. Joint naval drills became more frequent. Intelligence sharing expanded. Discussions about missile defense and regional stability grew more urgent. Inside Japan, there were debates about what its self-defense forces should be allowed to do. Some argued Japan should remain as pacifist as possible. Others said the country had to take on more responsibility in its own defense and in supporting allies. Through all the arguments, one fact remained constant. The security treaty with the United States was at the center of Japan's defense strategy. On the American side, Japan was increasingly seen as one of the most reliable allies in Asia. While relationships with other countries sometimes swung wildly, Japan was stable, democratic, and predictable. For American leaders looking at a complex and dangerous region, that consistency was extremely valuable. Today, the alliance between Japan and the United States is built on more than just fear of a common enemy. It is tied together by trade, technology, shared democratic values, and millions of human connections. Japanese companies employ workers all across America. American companies invest heavily in Japan. Students cross the ocean to study in each other's universities. Tourists visit each other's cities, temples, theme parks, and natural wonders. Japanese and American scientists work together on new technologies. Gamers on both sides play the same titles without thinking twice about where they came from. Of course, the relationship is not perfect. In Japan, especially in Okinawa, many residents are frustrated by the noise, crime, and accidents associated with U.S. military bases. Protests and political conflicts sometimes flare. In the United States, some people question why American soldiers and taxpayers should defend other countries at all. There are also lingering questions about history. Some Japanese politicians' visits to controversial war shrines or debates over how textbooks describe the war can anger neighbors and occasionally frustrate American observers. History is heavy, and it never fully disappears. But what's remarkable is that even with all these tensions, the alliance holds. The disagreements are real, but they exist inside a relationship that both sides see as essential. Think about that journey for a second. In the 1940s, Japan and America were locked in a war so vicious that leaders seriously discussed invasions, massive casualties, and possibly the destruction of entire societies. Cities burned, civilians suffered. The memory of Pearl Harbor and Hiroshima is seared into the history of both nations. And yet, in the decades that followed, those same nations chose a different path. Instead of permanent punishment, there was rebuilding. Instead of endless occupation, there were treaties. Instead of keeping each other weak, they helped each other grow. Instead of teaching their children to hate, they gradually allowed them to be curious, to visit, to study, to eat each other's food, to enjoy each other's stories. Japan versus America became Japan and America. That doesn't mean everything is perfect or guaranteed. Alliances change. Global power balances shift, new crises can test old friendships. But the story of Japan and the United States shows that even the bitterest enemies can become close allies when interests align, strategies are smart, and ordinary people connect across old lines. So the next time you see a Japanese car on an American highway, an American movie in a Japanese theater, or a joint military exercise in the Pacific, remember, less than a lifetime ago, those same countries were trying to sink each other's ships. Now, they rely on each other to keep the waters calm. If this story taught you something new about Japan, America, and how fast relationships between nations can change, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Do you think this alliance will stay strong over the next 50 years, or are there cracks starting to show? Let me know what you think in the comments. If you enjoyed this deep dive, and you want more stories that uncover the hidden side of history, geopolitics, and culture between countries, make sure you hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next episode. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.